December 18, 1854. A construction crew breaking ground for a new church foundation in what was once Cypress Hollow, Louisiana, made a discovery that would rewrite everything the town thought it knew about its own history. Buried 3 feet beneath the ruins of an old smokehouse, they found them. 73 human bones. Femurs. Ribs. Fragments of skulls. All bearing the same distinctive markings, deep grooves consistent with butchering. With preparation. With cooking. But here's what makes this discovery truly chilling. These weren't the remains of some forgotten massacre. These weren't casualties of war or victims of disease. According to the territorial records and church archives that were sealed for over a century, these bones belonged to travelers, drifters, and locals who had simply vanished between 1849 and 1854. And every single one of them was last seen at the same location. A modest cottage at the edge of the swamp, owned by 2 sisters who were beloved throughout the parish. Sisters who fed the entire community when neighboring towns were starving. Sisters whose smokehouse never stopped producing meat, even though they owned no livestock, purchased no animals, and never once explained where their endless supply came from. This is the story of Oule and Mabel Tibido, the Cannibal Sisters of Louisiana. And the town that ate from their table for 5 years before anyone dared to ask the question that would tear their community apart. What have we been eating? Cypress Hollow, Louisiana. 1849. If you stood at the center of this swamp town on a humid August morning, you'd see what everyone else saw. A community struggling to survive. The surrounding parishes were experiencing what historians would later call the Hunger Years. Crops failed season after season. Livestock died from disease. Neighboring towns rationed food so strictly that families were eating once a day, sometimes less. Children grew thin. The elderly grew weaker. And the desperation that comes from empty stomachs began to change people in ways they didn't recognize. But Cypress Hollow was different. Somehow, impossibly, this town thrived. Tables stayed full. Families ate heartily. The sick received nourishing broths. Widows found baskets of smoked meat on their doorsteps. And at the center of this inexplicable abundance were 2 women who seemed sent by Providence itself. Oule Tibido, the elder sister, was 42 years old. Sharp-eyed. Graceful. She moved through town with the quiet authority of someone who understood the weight of hunger and chose to lift it. Her younger sister, Mabel, was 37. Softer in appearance, but equally devoted to what they called their mission, feeding those who could not feed themselves. They lived in a neat cottage with lace curtains and an antique piano. They attended church every Sunday. They smiled at children and remembered everyone's names. They were, by every measure the town could see, saints. Behind their cottage stood the smokehouse. A strange, slanted structure with blackened walls and a chimney that never stopped releasing thick, dark smoke into the humid air. It smelled of garlic and peppercorn and something else. Something metallic that caught in the back of your throat if you breathed too deeply. The doors were always locked. The sisters never invited anyone inside. And on the days when the smoke rose highest, filling the town with that rich, unmistakable fragrance, people would come to collect their share. Taking whatever they needed. Never asking questions. Never looking too closely at what was being handed to them through that narrow doorway. Because when you're hungry, truly, desperately hungry, you don't question a miracle. You just eat. The first crack in this carefully maintained illusion appeared in March of 1852, when Father Henry Devereaux arrived in Cypress Hollow to serve as the parish priest. He was an outsider. A man from New Orleans who had never experienced the gnawing, relentless hunger that the town had survived. And because he had never known that desperation, he could see what others chose to ignore. Father Henry noticed patterns. Travelers who stopped at the Tibido cottage for lodging were never seen leaving. A hunter from Arkansas who boasted about the furs he'd sell in Baton Rouge vanished after accepting the sisters' hospitality. A drifter who played fiddle in the town square for coins disappeared after Mabel invited him for supper. 6 missing persons in 4 months. All last seen at the same location. But what disturbed Father Henry most was something the townspeople had normalized. The sisters never purchased livestock. Not from the local market. Not from neighboring parishes. Not from traveling merchants. They owned no pigs, no cattle, no goats. Yet their smokehouse operated continuously, producing enough meat to feed dozens of families week after week, month after month, year after year. Father Henry began his investigation quietly, going through the town registry, speaking carefully with longtime residents, watching the cottage at odd hours. He saw things that made his blood turn cold. Mabel's apron stained red before dawn. Heavy bundles being dragged from the cottage to the smokehouse under cover of darkness. And one evening in October, as fog crept in from the swamp, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A scream. Low and guttural and primal. Coming from inside that locked smokehouse. Followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. But when Father Henry tried to bring his concerns to the town council, he was met with resistance. Not anger. Not disbelief. Something worse. Willful ignorance. Because the people of Cypress Hollow had made an unspoken choice. They would rather keep eating than know the truth. It wasn't until young Jack Theriot, a 12-year-old boy who ran errands for the sisters, pressed his eye against a warped board on the side of the smokehouse that the first eyewitness account emerged. What he saw through that gap would finally force the town to confront what they had been consuming. What they had been complicit in. What they had chosen not to see. Jack saw hooks. Dozens of them. Hanging from the ceiling beams. And on those hooks hung cuts of meat that were unmistakable in their shape. Arms. Legs. Torsos. Prepared with the same care a butcher gives to livestock. Seasoned. Smoked. Ready to be served at the tables of good Christian families who attended church on Sunday and said grace before every meal. The boy ran. Straight to Father Henry. And the priest knew that the time for quiet investigation was over. The truth, terrible and complete, was about to surface. And once it did, Cypress Hollow would never be the same. The question wasn't just what the sisters had done. The question was what the town would do now that they could no longer pretend they didn't know. If you're finding this story as disturbing and compelling as we intended, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the darkest corners of American history that most people are too afraid to talk about. Don't miss what happens next. Jack Theriot's testimony reached the parish sheriff by nightfall on November 3, 1852. Sheriff Thomas Guthrie was a man caught between two impossible realities. On one hand, he had a child's eyewitness account of what could only be described as a charnel house. On the other hand, he had 2 of the most respected women in the community, women who had single-handedly kept his town from starvation, women who had fed his own family through the worst of the hunger years. The choice should have been simple. The law is the law. But in Cypress Hollow, nothing was simple anymore. Sheriff Guthrie made a decision that would haunt him until his death 20 years later. He would investigate privately before making any arrests. He would give the sisters a chance to explain. He would approach this delicately, because if Jack Theriot was wrong, if this was some misunderstanding or the overactive imagination of a frightened child, then the entire town would turn against the boy and his family. But if Jack was right, then Sheriff Guthrie would have to confront a truth more horrifying than anything he'd encountered in 30 years of law enforcement. On the morning of November 5, Sheriff Guthrie arrived at the Tibido cottage with 2 deputies and Father Henry Devereaux. He knocked on the door with a calm authority that betrayed none of the dread coiling in his stomach. Oule answered. She was wearing a clean white apron and drying her hands on a kitchen towel. She smiled at him the way she always did, warm and welcoming, and asked if he'd like to come in for coffee. The sheriff declined. He asked, as politely as possible, if he could inspect the smokehouse. There had been some concerns, he explained. Some questions about missing travelers. Nothing serious, he assured her. Just routine. Oule's smile never faltered. Of course, she said. She had nothing to hide. She retrieved the key from a hook by the door and led them around the cottage to the smokehouse entrance. She unlocked the heavy wooden door, pushed it open, and stepped aside. The smell hit them first. It was overpowering. Not the pleasant aroma of smoked meat that the town had grown accustomed to, but something fouler. Something that spoke of decay and concealment and desperate attempts to mask the truth with herbs and spices. Sheriff Guthrie stepped inside, and his worst fears materialized before his eyes. The hooks that Jack had described hung from every beam. Most were empty now, but 3 still held what could no longer be denied as human remains. A leg, severed cleanly at the hip and knee. An arm, stripped of skin and prepared for smoking. And a torso, headless and limbless, hanging like livestock in a slaughterhouse. The sheriff's deputies began to vomit. Father Henry fell to his knees and began to pray. And Oule Tibido stood in the doorway, still smiling, still calm, and said the words that would echo through Louisiana history for generations. We were only trying to help. People were so hungry. We couldn't just let them starve. The arrest happened quickly after that. Oule called for her sister Mabel, who emerged from the cottage wiping her hands on an identical white apron. Neither woman resisted. Neither woman showed remorse. They packed a small bag of personal belongings, asked if they could bring their Bible, and walked calmly to the sheriff's wagon as neighbors began to gather in the street. Word spread through Cypress Hollow like wildfire. Within hours, the entire town knew. The meat they had been eating. The nourishment that had sustained them through the hunger years. The mysterious abundance that had saved their children from starvation. It had come from human flesh. From travelers who trusted the wrong people. From drifters who knocked on the wrong door. From locals who disappeared and were mourned and were consumed by the very people who claimed to grieve them. The community's response was fractured and violent. Some families burned every pot and pan they owned, convinced that the contamination could never be washed away. Others denied the accusations entirely, insisting that this was some conspiracy to destroy 2 innocent women. Fights broke out in the streets. Marriages collapsed under the weight of guilt and accusation. Children were forbidden from playing with the children of families who had accepted food from the sisters. The town that had been united by shared survival now tore itself apart over shared complicity. Because the terrible truth that no one wanted to acknowledge was this: they had known. Maybe not consciously. Maybe not explicitly. But somewhere deep in their bones, they had known that the sisters' generosity was unnatural. That the supply was too consistent. That the meat tasted slightly different from pork or venison or beef. They had known, and they had eaten anyway. Because hunger is a powerful force. And denial is even more powerful. The investigation that followed the arrests uncovered the full scope of the sisters' operation. Sheriff Guthrie and a team of deputies excavated the area around the smokehouse and found the burial site that would later be discovered by construction workers in 1854. 73 victims. 73 people who had trusted the wrong kindness. The victims ranged from traveling merchants to local widows to children who had wandered too far from home. Oule and Mabel had kept meticulous records, hidden beneath the floorboards of their cottage. A ledger that detailed each victim by name, by weight, by the cuts of meat they had yielded, and by the families who had received those portions. It was a butcher's inventory. Clinical. Precise. Horrifying in its casual efficiency. But the most disturbing entries in that ledger were the names of people who were still alive. People who had come close to being victims but had been spared for reasons the sisters never fully explained. One entry read, "Thomas Gaines, too well known, too risky." Another, "Sarah Devlin, too thin, not worth the effort." And a third, "Marcus Tibido, cousin, family bond too strong." These notes revealed a chilling calculus. The sisters weren't mad. They weren't acting out of psychotic compulsion or uncontrollable urges. They were making rational, calculated decisions about who could be taken and who couldn't. They were running a business. And their product was human flesh. The trial of Oule and Mabel Tibido began on January 14, 1853, in the parish courthouse. The proceedings lasted 6 days. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the bones, the ledger, the testimony of Jack Theriot, the physical inspection of the smokehouse, and the statements of families who identified missing loved ones from the sisters' records. The defense attempted to argue temporary insanity brought on by the trauma of starvation. They claimed that the hunger years had broken something fundamental in the sisters' minds, that they had acted out of a twisted sense of charity, that they genuinely believed they were saving the town. But the ledger contradicted this defense at every turn. The entries were too detailed, too organized, too rational. These were not the writings of mad women. These were the records of predators who had found an opportunity and exploited it with cold efficiency. Oule Tibido took the stand on the 4th day of the trial. She spoke for 3 hours. She described watching their neighbors starve during the first year of the crop failures. She described the desperation in mothers' eyes as they rationed food among children. She described the elderly who died quietly in their beds, too proud to beg for help. And then she described the moment when everything changed. A drifter had come to their door in the winter of 1849, asking for shelter. He was rude, aggressive. He tried to steal from them during the night. Oule caught him, and Mabel struck him with a cast-iron pan. He died from the blow. And as they stood over his body, trying to decide what to do, Oule looked at her sister and said what neither of them had dared to voice. "We could feed the town. We could save everyone. No one would have to starve." They butchered him that night, using the same techniques their father had taught them for preparing livestock. They smoked the meat in the old smokehouse that hadn't been used in years. They distributed small portions to the families most in need, claiming it was venison from a successful hunting trip. And the gratitude they received was overwhelming. Families wept with relief. Children ate until they were full for the first time in months. The sisters were praised as angels of mercy. And Oule testified that in that moment, they made a decision. They would continue. They would find others. Travelers who wouldn't be missed. Drifters with no families. People on the margins of society. And they would transform those lives into sustenance for a community on the edge of collapse. In Oule's mind, it was a mathematical equation. One life could feed 30 people. One stranger could save a dozen children. The morality was simple. The greater good justified the means. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. They found both sisters guilty of 73 counts of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. But there was a complication. Louisiana law at the time required that executions be carried out in the parish where the crimes occurred. And the people of Cypress Hollow could not agree on whether the sisters should die. The town was split almost evenly. Half believed the sisters were monsters who deserved the harshest punishment. Half believed the sisters had saved the community and should be shown mercy. The debate became so heated that the governor intervened, moving the execution to Baton Rouge to prevent civil unrest. Oule and Mabel Tibido were hanged on March 17, 1853, before a crowd of over 2,000 people. Witnesses reported that neither woman showed fear. They stood on the gallows holding hands, and Oule's last words were recorded by 3 separate journalists. "We fed you when no one else would. You lived because of us. History will remember that truth. But history did not remember the way Oule predicted. The story of the Cannibal Sisters was deliberately buried by local authorities and church officials who feared the stigma would destroy Cypress Hollow's reputation. Records were sealed. The trial transcripts were locked away. Families who had received food from the sisters were quietly paid to relocate to other parishes. Within a decade, most of the original residents had left. New families moved in, unaware of the town's dark history. The cottage was burned to the ground. The smokehouse was demolished, though its foundation remained until the church construction in 1854 finally unearthed the burial site. For over a century, the story existed only as whispered legend. Old-timers would tell versions of it to scare children. Folklorists collected fragmented accounts. But the full truth remained hidden in sealed archives until historians began piecing it together in the 1970s. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the crime itself, but the complicity of an entire community. The psychological burden carried by the survivors of Cypress Hollow was immense. These were people who had eaten human flesh unknowingly. These were parents who had fed their children meat from murdered strangers. These were families who had survived the hunger years only to discover that their survival came at an unspeakable cost. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. Families broke apart. Marriages ended. Some survivors never spoke again about what happened, taking their guilt and horror to their graves. Others became obsessed with confession and penance, traveling to churches across Louisiana to seek absolution from priests who had no framework for understanding their sin. How do you forgive yourself for eating human flesh when you didn't know what you were doing? How do you reconcile the fact that your child's survival depended on another person's murder? These are questions that haunted Cypress Hollow for generations. The psychological profile of Oule and Mabel Tibido has fascinated criminologists and psychologists for decades. Unlike most cases of cannibalism, which are driven by psychosis or sexual deviance or survival desperation, the Tibido sisters operated from a twisted sense of altruism. They genuinely believed they were helping their community. Their letters, which were preserved despite the sealing of most official records, reveal a consistent pattern of thought. They saw themselves as martyrs. As women willing to carry the moral burden of terrible acts so that others could live. They believed that their willingness to kill and butcher human beings was a form of sacrifice. They were taking on the sin so that others could remain innocent. This delusion of righteous purpose makes their case particularly disturbing because it demonstrates how easily moral frameworks can be inverted under the right circumstances. When an entire community is starving, when children are dying, when the social order is collapsing, the normal boundaries of right and wrong become negotiable. The sisters didn't see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as practical. As necessary. As the only ones brave enough to do what needed to be done. This case also raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of complicity and willful ignorance. The people of Cypress Hollow were not stupid. They were not naive. They noticed that travelers disappeared. They noticed that the sisters had no livestock. They noticed that the meat tasted unusual. But they chose not to investigate because the alternative, admitting what they suspected and losing their food source, was too terrifying to contemplate. This pattern of willful ignorance appears repeatedly throughout history. Communities that allow abuse to continue because acknowledging it would disrupt their stability. Societies that ignore atrocities because confronting them would require uncomfortable action. The citizens of Cypress Hollow made a collective choice to prioritize survival over truth. And that choice meant they became participants in the sisters' crimes, whether they admitted it or not. Father Henry Devereaux, the priest who first raised concerns about the sisters, spent the rest of his life grappling with his own culpability. His journals, preserved at Tulane University, reveal a man tormented by the question of timing. He knew something was wrong in March of 1852. But he didn't push hard enough for an investigation until November. How many people died in those 8 months while he gathered evidence and deliberated over the right course of action? How many victims could have been saved if he had acted immediately on his suspicions instead of trying to build an airtight case? Father Henry eventually left the priesthood, unable to reconcile his faith with the horrors he had witnessed. He died in 1871, and his final journal entry is a haunting meditation on the nature of evil. He wrote, "I have learned that evil is not always a sudden violence. Sometimes it is a slow accommodation. A gradual acceptance of the unacceptable. A community that learns to live with horror because the alternative is too painful to bear." The sisters were monsters, yes. But we created the conditions that allowed them to thrive. We fed the monster because we were afraid of starving. And in the end, we became the monster ourselves. The legal ramifications of the Tibido case led to significant changes in Louisiana law. Prior to this case, cannibalism was not explicitly criminalized because lawmakers had never imagined it would be necessary. The murders themselves were clearly illegal, but the act of consuming human flesh and distributing it to others fell into a legal gray area. Following the trial, Louisiana became one of the first states to pass specific statutes prohibiting the desecration of human remains and the knowing distribution of human tissue for consumption. These laws influenced similar legislation across the United States and established legal precedents that are still referenced today in cases involving body disposal and tissue trafficking. The Tibido case also prompted reforms in how missing persons were tracked and investigated in rural areas. The ease with which the sisters had targeted travelers and drifters revealed massive gaps in law enforcement coordination between parishes. The state established protocols for reporting and investigating disappearances that would eventually evolve into the missing persons systems we use today. The cultural legacy of this case extends far beyond legal reforms. Louisiana folklore is filled with stories of the Cannibal Sisters, though many versions have been distorted or romanticized over time. Some retellings portray them as victims of circumstance, driven mad by hunger. Others depict them as supernatural entities, monsters who weren't fully human. The truth, as always, is more disturbing than fiction. Oule and Mabel Tibido were ordinary women who made extraordinary choices under extreme circumstances. They were not possessed. They were not insane. They were human beings who convinced themselves that murder and cannibalism were justified by the greater good they believed they were achieving. And that humanity, that rational calculation of evil, is what makes their story so unsettling. Because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Under the right conditions, ordinary people are capable of monstrous acts. And communities are capable of accepting those acts if the alternative threatens their survival. The town of Cypress Hollow no longer exists under that name. It was renamed St. Augustine in 1867 as part of a deliberate effort to erase the association with the Tibido case. The church that was built over the burial site stands to this day, though few of the current parishioners know the full history of the ground beneath their feet. Local historians have attempted several times to place a historical marker acknowledging what happened, but each proposal has been met with fierce resistance from residents who fear the stigma would damage property values and tourism. This ongoing effort to suppress the story reflects the same impulse that led the original community to ignore the sisters' crimes. The desire to avoid uncomfortable truths. The preference for comfortable lies. The choice to prioritize reputation over reality. But the story refuses to stay buried. Every few years, a new article or documentary or book examines the Tibido case, bringing it back into public consciousness. Scholars continue to study the sealed records. Descendants of the original residents occasionally come forward with family stories passed down through generations. And the fundamental questions raised by this case remain relevant. How do we judge people who commit terrible acts for what they believe are noble reasons? How do we hold communities accountable for their collective choices to ignore evil? How do we ensure that desperation never again creates conditions where cannibalism becomes normalized? These questions don't have easy answers. But they must be asked. Because the alternative is to forget. And forgetting ensures that history will repeat itself. The victims of Oule and Mabel Tibido deserve to be remembered. 73 people whose names were recorded in a butcher's ledger. Travelers seeking shelter. Drifters looking for work. Locals who trusted their neighbors. Children who wandered too close to the wrong house. Each of them was a complete human being with hopes and fears and people who loved them. And each of them was reduced to meat, weighed and portioned and distributed to families who never knew they were consuming someone's father, someone's daughter, someone's friend. The tragedy of Cypress Hollow is not just that these murders happened. The tragedy is that they were accepted. That an entire community participated, however unknowingly, in the consumption of human beings. That the normal moral order collapsed so completely that cannibalism became an act of charity. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate survivors. Children who grew up in Cypress Hollow during those years carried the trauma into adulthood. They passed stories and anxieties to their own children. Families who had relocated to escape the stigma often hid their origins, creating generations of people who grew up knowing there was some dark secret in their family history but never learning the details. This pattern of intergenerational trauma is common in communities that experience collective atrocity. The wounds don't heal just because people stop talking about them. They fester. They create patterns of silence and shame that affect behavior for decades. Even now, researchers who study the descendants of Cypress Hollow families report higher rates of anxiety, depression, and complicated relationships with food and trust. The legacy of those 5 years between 1849 and 1854 continues to ripple through time, affecting people who weren't born until a century after the crimes occurred. There is no redemption in this story. No silver lining. No lesson that makes the horror worthwhile. What happened in Cypress Hollow stands as a stark reminder of human capacity for both survival and cruelty. It demonstrates how quickly civilized behavior can collapse when resources become scarce. It shows how communities can become complicit in evil through the simple act of looking away. And it proves that the line between victim and perpetrator is thinner than we like to believe. The people of Cypress Hollow thought of themselves as good Christians, law-abiding citizens, loving parents. And they were. But they were also people who ate human flesh and convinced themselves it was acceptable because the alternative was starvation. That duality, that capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, is perhaps the most disturbing element of this entire case. If you've made it this far, you understand why this story had to be told. Why we cannot allow it to remain buried in sealed archives and forgotten graveyards. Subscribe to this channel for more deep investigations into the darkest chapters of American history. Share this documentary with anyone who thinks they know the worst that humanity is capable of. Because the truth is always more complex and more disturbing than we imagine. And only by confronting these truths can we hope to prevent them from happening again. Thank you for watching. And remember, the monsters in our history were never just monsters. They were people. Just like us.